Bralen Trice profiles as a pressure guy, but what does he need to do to become Atlanta's next great sack artist?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Falcons for so long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day and makes this podcast your first listen or first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer of this pod is to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is a comprehensive breakdown of the Falcons' third round draft pick, Bralen Trice. I finished the film. Finally, we're a month after the draft. We will get the Zion logo like 4th of July or whatever. We're on that pace this year. So it is what it is. But, it's part of the summer of tremendous content, right? We're going to be still talking about things that other people finished talking about a month from now, and tremendous content. But anyway, so earlier last week, I guess you could say, we broke down what the average production for what a day two sort of pass rusher does as rookies to sort of project what guys like Trice and Rukaroro and Brandon Doyles might do this year to add to the pass rush. And the data, if you missed that episode, was over the last 5 years, he averaged third round edge, like a Bralen Trice, averaged about 2 sacks and 14 pressures in their first year in the NFL. And I don't expect Bralen Trice to sort of, be the exception to the rule when it comes to that type of production, right? Now, it's worth noting that the average third round edge rusher only plays about 288 snaps in his rookie season. And we'll talk about, what Bralen Trice needs to do in order to see significant snaps as a rookie and early in his NFL career. But, I don't think you would expect. I think Bralen Trice was a very productive college player. And so the idea that he won't immediately produce in the NFL, I think is a little bit of a question, right? You probably heard like, oh, 150 pressures that he's had over the last 2 years combined was the most of any player in college football, according to PFF, right? And I watched 10 games of his from this past year, and I counted 114 pass rush wins across those 10 games, which is an insane number. However, I don't think a large percentage of those wins really translate to the next level. I think the thing that translates the best for Bralen Trice in order for him to be a high-level pass rusher is going to be his power. About 30% of those wins were based off of like power-based moves, which was the second most number in terms of category. And we talked a little bit about how power translates when we talked about the top 3 edges this past offseason in this draft, specifically with a guy like Jared Verse, right? I don't think Trice's power is quite on the same level as Jared Verse, but I do think Trice is probably like a B, maybe B plus in terms of like a power rusher, using the bull rush, using some of those long arm moves that can be sort of the foundation of his pass rush plan and repertoire in the NFL. Now, the problem with power rushers is that they tend to be more pressure guys, not sack guys, right? That's true of Zach Harrison. That was true of Tack McKinley. That's true of, Brandon Graham's another great example of that. And that's actually reflected in Trice's college production, right? PFF had him at 80 pressures this past year, 8 sacks. That's a 10% sack conversion rate. That ranked 19 out of 20 edges that were drafted this past year that had 2023 PFF data. If you take the 32 edges that were taken last year that we have data for, that would rank 49 out of 52, that 10% sack conversion rate compared to those guys in their senior year going into the NFL. And then you look at Trice's overall career sack conversion rate at Washington, it was only about 12%. So, the reason behind this is why pressure guy or power guys tend to be pressure guys is if I'm an offensive lineman, like imagine me, I'm an offensive lineman if you're on video watching me, right? And you get your hands inside into my chest, and you start putting me on roller skates back into the quarterback, my natural reaction is going to clamp down on your hands to try to stop, you put me on roller skates. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it really hard for you as the pass rusher now with your hands engaged like this to disengage in order to sack the quarterback. So it's easy for power guys to collapse the pocket and pressure the quarterback, but it's harder for those guys to get a lot of sacks. And that's partially why I don't expect Trice to be this prolific sack artist in the NFL. He wasn't that in college. I don't think it's going to get any easier in the NFL. All right. And out of those 114 pass rush wins I charted across 10 games, only 7 sacks in that sample. 4 of those sacks were cleanup sacks. The 3 other ones were basically essentially second effort plays, right? Where he used a move and then he won on his second move, right? And then even if you look at the 19 quarterback hits I charted, roughly half of those were either cleanup plays or second effort plays. So his profile screams a pressure guy. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a complementary player, but that's not necessarily going to be the engine that drives your pass rush. And when we get to player comps, we're going to talk about some guys that have had successful careers, with that sort of profile. But part of the reason why I think he struggles to convert those pressures into sacks is because he has limited athleticism. He doesn't have necessarily those explosive traits to win with speed. Only about 17% of the wins I charted were sort of speed-based moves. You look at his 10-yard split, his broad jumps, his vertical jump, those explosive metrics. He tested like in the 40th percentile in all of those things, so below average for an edge rusher. Now, what Bralen Trice does do a good job of is I think he does a good job timing the snap at times, and that will enhance his speed rush. But I don't know if that's something that you can just rely on consistently at the NFL level, especially with the plus athletes that you're going to be facing going up, at that offensive tackle position. And the way that Bralen Trice preferred to win was with the sort of technique, right? Hand usage, pass rush moves, and all that. But the problem was, I don't think he was that great in that area. And going back to those top 3 edges like Latu out of UCLA, we talked a lot about Latu and his, really enhanced technique. And he was very good at timing his hands, timing those chops and those swipes and whatnot. And Trice was just not, right? About 32% of his wins were technical based moves, but he wasn't actually good at hitting those moves, right? It's the idea of you beat the hand, you beat the man when it comes to pass rushers. And he just didn't do a good job beating those hands. Those offensive tackles were often able to still get their hands on him after he would try these swipes and whatnot. And that contributed to why he couldn't finish those plays, because without that sort of elite burst and bend, he couldn't necessarily get under those guys, dip, rip, and do the things to finish those plays after he would do those swipe moves. And so what's interesting about Trice and his testing is like his agility testing suggests that the bend is actually there, right? He was 92nd percentile in the short shuttle, 50th percentile in the 3-cone, but we don't base our evaluations off of stopwatches. We base it off of film, and the film tells me that Trice's bend is subpar, right? Now, maybe the testing suggests that there's more potential there, untapped potential there than, the film suggests, but my takeaway is just kind of like, I think he trained really hard for those agility tests and tested really well. Not necessarily those are reflective of what he does on film. And then the other issue I had with from a technical standpoint is about 40% of those technical wins that he had involved like swim moves. And I've been watching the NFL film for over a decade, and I don't think swim moves are an effective way to beat NFL offensive tackles. Guards and centers is a different conversation, but offensive tackles, no. And so to me, when I remove that data, all the swim moves out of the data, and now it's 98 wins, and then you look at how it profiles, about 35% of that, those 98 wins are power based. Technique is now 21%, speed is now 19%, right? And then 24% is other, and the other would be like those cleanup plays, effort plays, stunts and twists and those types of things, sort of scheme stuff and whatnot. And that to me better matches up with his profile based off of what my eyes are seeing, right? The power being his best asset, the motor, the relentless effort, those other plays being sort of his second best trait. And then the technique and speed are okay, but they're not necessarily things that I think are going to really be a major threat for NFL offensive tackles. And because they weren't necessarily a threat for, college offensive tackles in a major way. And so again, that profile tells me that his ceiling as a pass rusher is probably not going to be particularly high, at least as a sack artist, right? I could see him being a 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 type of sack guy, as opposed to someone that's probably, got that 8 to 10 sack potential. And I think in the right circumstances, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the player comps later in the episode. I think in the right circumstances, like he could be more productive than, that 4 to 6 sack guy. But more than likely, most years he's going to be more in line with sort of a third edge than necessarily one of the top 2 guys that you want, consistently out there on 3rd and 7 to get after the quarterback. And so while I don't think he has a high-end pass rush profile, I do think his success in the NFL and his ability to develop potentially as a pass rusher hinges on some of his early success, and that's going to hinge a lot on his run defense. And that's an area that I think Trice also needs to improve upon, because that's going to potentially be the biggest obstacle for him to get early reps in the NFL. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, it is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL in the playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. You can bet on NBA and NHL playoffs. You can bet on the NBA draft that's coming up with the Atlanta Hawks. You can bet on the upcoming NFL season. You want to bet over under wins for the Atlanta Falcons? Hey, you want to bet on Bralen Trice being Defensive Rookie of the Year odds? Well, guess what? He's got the 29th best odds. And guess who have the best odds? It's Dallas Turner and Laiatu Latu. But you can also bet on player specials. How many yards is Kirk Cousins going to have? How many touchdowns is he going to have? You can bet on if Bijan or Drake or Kyle are going to get 10 plus touchdowns this year. All the action you could possibly want. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So as we continue today's episode, let me tell you about the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube, the first of its kind, provided for you by the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, you can also check it out on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app to get the latest stories about all the biggest stories in all of sports, like NBA Finals, NHL Finals, all that and more. I'm sure horse racing is going on or something like that as well. So check that out on Locked On Sports Today. And if you want more local flavor, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube as well. So when we talk about Bralen Trice, I think run defense is kind of the key for him, at least early in his NFL career, right? And I don't think he was a particularly good run defender at Washington. And I think he was able to get away with being kind of a subpar run defender because he was so productive for Washington as a pass rusher, right? You can kind of offset that, right? It's like, pass rushing is king, right? And so when I look at his run defense in the games I charted, the 10 games I charted, I only charted 8 run stops. And a stop is basically a tackle that is essentially a success for the defense. He was key blocked 9 times. And that basically means when the offense had a big run or a touchdown or whatever, he was the guy that, was the key block that, got blocked on that play that led to that. And then he had 14 missed tackles. So a lot more negative plays on the film in term versus positive plays when it comes to run defense. And the tackling issues, I think, is related to something we talked about last week when we talked about Clark Phillips and the obstacle that he may have being the Falcons starting outside corner due to his short arms. And we talked about how arm length is sort of correlated to, being a good tackler. And Trice doesn't have the longest arms. 32.5-inch arms for an edge rusher is 10th percentile, 12th percentile wingspan for an edge rusher. And then you couple that with his limited athleticism, that leads to him sort of missing some tackles in open space due to that. Now, Trice was an every down player for Washington, but I don't think he was as disciplined against the run as you would like to be. Some of that was reflected when you would see him on read option plays where he would sort of crash down on a running back and the quarterback would pull the ball and scamper for a big gain. If you watch the USC and Michigan games, you'll see a couple of those plays. He also had a habit of losing gap integrity when it came to runs. That's some of the key block stuff that we're talking about, where he'd get walled off or he'd try to shoot up field and lose his gap fit and run fit and whatnot. And, I think the type of run defender that he's probably best suited to be, which is that sort of disruptive, penetrating type of guy. It's the idea of like, we're stop the run on the way to the quarterback. And, Dan Quinn's defenses in Dallas and Atlanta were like that. Some of these teams that employ wide 9 edges, like the Jets and Browns, tend to operate that way as well. And that's a perfectly valid way to operate in terms of your run defense. I'm not convinced that the Falcons are going to really operate that way this year under Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake. I think they're going to want their edges to do a better job setting the edge, holding the point of attack than necessarily just penetrating upfield. And so I think Trice needs to be better at that. I've seen him do it. It's just not consistent enough, right? Like I could put together a reel of like 15 plays of him looking outstanding against the run, The problem is, of course, like I don't know how many more plays beyond those 15 that are on the film. And in the NFL, to be a good run defender, like you have to put together those 15 plays every week as opposed to 15 plays over 15 games, right? And so that's going to be an obstacle for Trice. So he needs to get better there if he's going to want to play early in his NFL career so he can get the reps so that he can become a better pass rusher. The other issue that I think he's going to have to overcome early in his career is, if he's not a starter, right? Special teams, right? And he doesn't really have a lot of experience, and I don't necessarily think he has the skill set to play special teams, right? We know that if you're not a starter, special teams matters. The tackling concerns, the lack of long speed are things that don't necessarily project well to being a plus, impact special teams player. One of the pet peeves I always have over the years is sort of the assumption that a lot of people make is like, oh, well, just put the guy on special teams if they're not a good offensive or defensive player. And it's like, special teams requires a skill set. Maybe it's not the same skill set that requires to be a high level offensive or defensive player. Like, for example, like Matt Slater, the longtime Patriots stalwart special teams ace, no one's going to confuse Matt Slater and Julio Jones, right, in terms of what they can do from a skill set standpoint. But there is a certain skill set that Matt Slater has that allows him to basically spend a decade and a half as a special teams maven compared to, any run-of-the-mill undrafted free agent or mid-round draft pick or whatever the case may be. So we'll see if Trice can sort of develop that. I think that's going to be something that's going to be a point of emphasis because we know that these young players, like, hey, you're not going to come in right away and hit the ground running as an impact pass rusher. More than likely, again, Micah Parsons and the Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa exist, but like, I don't think Bralen Trice is going to be that guy. So he can emphasize that. I think he can work on that. And so that's one of the interesting things that, like, I know fans tend to get enamored with a player's potential in the ceiling. And that's one of the things I try to stress when we do these episodes where we tend to talk about the floor, because it's like, yeah, there's the ceiling may be high, but that ceiling is like 3 or 5 years away. Right. And these next 2 years that, we care about, right? Like we live in the present, right? These next 2 years, it's going to be where that floor is at. That's going to really determine what that player is. And so they need to have a good enough floor so that they can stick around long enough to reach that ceiling. That was one of the things we talked about with Ade Ogundeji, who just got cut by the Falcons when we drafted him. And I was like, yeah, Ade's fine, but he's probably doesn't have a high ceiling. And the other issue that he's going to have is like he doesn't bring enough juice as a pass rusher that probably over the next 2 years, the Falcons will bring in better players that are going to not allow him to reach his ceiling. And we saw that, over the last couple of years, and ultimately led to Ade getting cut before he made it to his, fourth training camp. So we will see about that with Bralen Trice. But that gets us, when we're talking about floors and ceilings, that gets us to the next portion and the final portion of today's episode, which is talking about some NFL player comps of players that, have, a similar ceiling, a similar floor for Bralen Trice. And we'll break that down, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Game Time is making getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier, and prices at Game Time actually go down the closer it gets to tip off. And the idea of buying NBA tickets for the finals can seem daunting and pretty expensive, but Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying those tickets. You can get last minute deals and save up to 60% off buying last minute for NBA Finals, sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever events near you. Their lowest price guarantee means Game Time will credit 110% the difference if you can find cheaper tickets in the same section and row for less. And their flash deals are going to allow you to save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, guys, we'll wrap up today's Bralen Trice episode, and tomorrow I believe we'll be talking with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters, and he's going to give us the lowdown on the Raheem Morris and, to a lesser extent, Jimmy Lake defensive scheme, and so that's going to sort of set the table for us, and then we'll probably have some mailbag episodes later this week because I'm ducking out of town after Memorial Day. So, if you want to submit questions for those mailbags, of course, you can hit me up via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on the YouTube side of things here on Locked On Falcons. You can become a Locked On Falcons Insider, and you'll get priority on those, or you can join the Discord in the link in the description below. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider, there's a link in the description below as well. So let's talk about NFL player comps, and how we do this is we do 3 different comps of floor, eye level, and ceiling, right? And we do sort of a range of outcomes with this. And it's not just simply to hedge or whatever, right? It's just because like there are so many unknown variables with these players in the NFL, like durability and coaching and scheme changes. Like, for example, like Jimmy Lake is going to be the 8th defensive coordinator that Grady Jarrett has had in going into year 10 in the NFL. And now Grady is certainly good enough to work in a multitude of schemes, regardless of who the DC is. But most NFL players are not Grady Jarrett. And so this stuff matters, and it's hard to sort of project these things. And that's why we do this spread of outcomes. So to remind you guys, if you're new here, the floor is, to me, what I think the player is day one. This is what I think Bralen Trice is going to be, week 1 when we play the Steelers. His ceiling to me is what his max potential is. To me, like the best case scenario, if he gets the max development, all the the durability, scheme stuff, all that stuff, he checks all those boxes and gets the best outcome there. And then the eye level is kind of the halfway point between the floor and the ceiling, which to me is the most likely or the likeliest outcome relative to those 2 endpoints. But so starting with the floor, someone threw this comparison to me a couple of weeks ago when it came to Bralen Trice, and I was like, I think I'm going to steal this one, and I am stealing it. It is Jacob Tuioti-Mariner. I love my former Falcon comps and I know you guys appreciate him because like you are familiar with the players. That's why we do them so much, right? And JTM played with the Falcons from 2019 to 2021. He started out his career in college at UCLA as like a 280-pound 5-tech defensive end. Then he kind of slimmed down, became more of a pure sort of edge, playing a little bit more in that sort of 3-4 hybrid defense that the Falcons employed in those years. Similar to Trice, JTM's not the greatest athlete. I think Trice is a little bit better as an athlete, but not by a huge degree. The real point of comparison is JTM is like that high effort player, doesn't have the ideal physical tools to be a high end pass rusher. JTM was a competent run defender and special teams player, so he could find ways to get on the field, even if you didn't necessarily bring a lot of juice as a pass rusher. I think Trice is bringing more juice as a pass rusher, but I'm also hopeful that he'll be able to, be better as a run defender, as a special teams player, so that he can get, on the field early at this point in time. But similar to JTM was in that 2020 year, which was his best year in the NFL, he's more of a rotational piece, more of a back-end rotational guy. And I think that's a starting point that Trice can build off of in year 1 into the future. And hopefully that leads to him reaching his ceiling down the road. And that comp I have is Marcus Golden. That's, to me, what the fully formed version of Bralen Trice is, another sort of high effort guy that doesn't have plus athletic traits. Golden has a more developed toolkit and arsenal of pass rush moves than Trice does at this point in time. And that's one of the benefits that a player like Golden, who is part of that same Vic Beasley and Grady Jarrett draft class in 2015, spending basically a decade in the NFL, you can develop an arsenal and toolkit of pass rush moves. Now, what's interesting about Golden is that he's had 3 double-digit sack seasons across the 9 years he's played in the NFL. And when you look at the 2 that he had in Arizona, one at the beginning of his career and one towards the end of his career, he was kind of like the third wheel to a pair of all pros, right? In 2016, his second year in the NFL, he had 12.5 sacks playing beside Calais Campbell and Chandler Jones. He came back to Arizona in 2021, had 11 sacks that year playing with Chandler Jones and J.J. Watt. And he had a 10-sack season sandwich in between theirs with the Giants in 2019. And there weren't as many marquee guys. Like they had Leonard Williams for the second half of that season after they made a midseason trade. But I think a lot of that production was just him being super relentless as a pass rusher with that high motor, similar to what Bralen Trice has. And when you take those 3 double-digit sack seasons and look at the other 6 years that Marcus Golden has played in the NFL, he's only had about 17.5 sacks, so a little less than 3 sacks per year across those 6 years. And if you extrapolate to a 17 game, how many sacks does he get per 17 games across those 6 years? It's about 3.8 sacks per year. And then you look at the pressures per 17 games, that's about 46 pressures. And so that to me is kind of where I expect Trice to be, going back to something I said earlier, maybe a 3, 4, 5, 6 sack guy, maybe a 40, 50 pressure guy at his best in most years. But like Golden, in the right circumstances, get the right scheme, right talent around him, like he could go off for much more. Now, whether that's going to be the situation here in Atlanta in the future remains to be seen. Again, that's probably 3+ years away for a player like Bralen Trice. And then, what is the Falcons pass rush going to look like in 2026 and 2027 when he gets there, right? Who's going to be around on the team? Is Grady going to be here? David Onyemata going to be here? Is Arnold Ebiketie going to be here? Who knows? So that's part of the reason why when others get super excited about the future of this draft class, whether it's Michael Penix or Rook or Bralen Trice and others, like it's harder for me to get excited because it's just like, yeah, that's like 3+ years away. And it's like, I don't even know what the team is going to look like. There's probably going to be so much roster turnover over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's going to change the match. Similar to what we talked about with Ade Ogundeji, like, are the Falcons going to have better options than Bralen Trice in 3 years? Or are they going to have worse options in 3? Who knows at this point in time? And so that's going to affect whether or not Bralen Trice gets that opportunity to sort of reach this sort of ceiling that we're talking about. So I think with Marcus Golden, final thoughts on that is that he's a good technician. I could see Trice growing into that, improving that technique and being better than he is right now with time, learning how to kind of maximize that technique to kind of offset, less than stellar athleticism. But again, I think that's sort of years away. And so what we're more likely to see from Bralen Trice, I think, is his eye level. And again, another former Falcon, Brooks Reed. It's funny because like Marcus Golden's a free agent, and I saw a Falcon fan put out a video that the Falcons should sign Marcus Golden the other day. So it's possible that all three of these comps might be former and future Falcons, but we'll see how that goes. But, Brooks Reed and Trice are very similar athletically. Brooks Reed didn't possess elite athletic tools, but we saw Brooks Reed learn one pass rush move, and that was the spin move that he spammed to death, and we enjoyed watching every second of it in 2016 and 2017 when he learned that from Dwight Freeney. Brooks Reed's played a decade in the NFL, 8 sort of core years where he was a regular rotation player and part-time starter. He had 21.5 sacks across those 8 years, so average about 2.5 per year, averaged about 29 pressures in those 8 years, so a notch or two below where Marcus Golden's quote-unquote typical season was outside of those double-digit sacks years. And Brooks Reed made his hay as a plus run defender and rotational piece. He also played special teams. He was just okay at that, but he was able to get by with that as a reserve player. And one hopes that Bralen Trice will develop into that type of player like Brooks Reed, because that's going to help extend his career. Like, again, Brooks Reed was getting 2.5 sacks a year, right? Like, you don't play a decade in the NFL getting 2.5 sacks a year. You play a decade in the NFL because you do other things other than do 2.5 sacks that teams value other than that. And that's mostly the run defense. And so that to me is going to be key for Bralen Trice, because again, I don't necessarily see that sort of potential to be, a high end pass rusher that can play a decade in the NFL because he's racking up sacks like that. But Brooks's best year as a pass rusher was his rookie year where he had 6 sacks. And that year, similar to kind of Marcus Golden, what we're talking about, J.J. Watt was a rookie that year, but, came in, was very good. Connor Barwin was their top guy. Brooks Reed really got an opportunity because Mario Williams got hurt that year. And so he got propelled into the lineup and made the most of it with 6 sacks, down the stretch that year. But, Brooks Reed, even at his best in Houston, was not the guy that was like driving the engine, driving the bus for that pass rush, right? Now, that Houston defense was a very good defense. It was coordinated by Wade Phillips. It was a top 5 unit. So he was a contributor on a very good defense. And similar when you look at arguably his next 2 best years as a pass rusher, which were 2016 and 2017 in Atlanta, the Falcons didn't have a great pass rush in those years, but they were at least league average, roughly around there in those years. And so again, like what I think Bralen Trice can be, that's a valuable plus contributor on a good pass rush or a good defense, but isn't necessarily going to be the thing that drives the engine. So my expectation for Bralen Trice this year is he's going to be probably the third edge behind Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter this year. I'll be curious to see how this new coaching staff emphasizes, the rotation, right? They didn't necessarily have a deep rotation last year with the Rams. We know that was a point of emphasis under the former DC Ryan Nielsen. The Rams basically got like a 6-man rotation and only really 2 edges playing in that rotation. That was Byron Young and Michael Hoyt. They played about 85% of the snaps last year. The third edge was basically an even split in the first half of the season. It was Zach Van Valkenburg and Keir Thomas in the second half of the season. And both of those guys, like, it was almost a perfect split, averaged about 11 snaps per game in each of those games that they played in. So I'll be curious if Bralen Trice is the third edge, like, does that mean he's only going to play like 10 or 15 snaps a game? Maybe that's a possibility. And again, we'll see what he could do with that. Or are we going to have a deeper rotation and guys like AK and Carter aren't going to be playing, 80+% of the snaps, and instead maybe only be playing like 40 or 50 or 60% of the snaps, which is the norm in the NFL. And that may open the door for a player like Bralen Trice to contribute more as a rookie. So we'll see if that is the case. But that is going to do it for us here, guys. Bralen Trice, a good player, but I wouldn't expect, future double-digit sack seasons like that if I were you. But that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your feedback on what you think Bralen Trice can be in the comments below and other places that you can contact me. And so tomorrow we'll be back with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters to talk more about Raheem Morris and this defensive scheme. But until then, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today, Locked On NFL shows here on YouTube. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.